Okay, so we'll make a start. I know there's some people will be joining us late. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. This session today looks at working with interpreters in mediation, not as a technical add-on, but as something that fundamentally changes how mediation works in practice. When an interpreter's involved, mediation needs to slow down, boundaries need to become more important, and the mediator carries additional responsibility for pace, clarity, and fairness. The aim today isn't to turn anyone into an expert in interpreted mediation, but it's to surface the practical considerations that make the biggest difference when this work is done, and the risks when it's done well, and the risks when it isn't. I'll be chairing the conversation with our panel, and we'll also be picking up questions from delegates as we go along or towards the end. So I'd like to introduce our panel. Well, I'd let them introduce themselves. So over to you guys.
Great. I'll start. My name is Tawheed Rahman. I do multilingual mediation as well as work with interpreters. I run Salam Mediation.
Hello, everybody. My name's Janet. I'm a consultant mediator and PPC for Reunite International Child Abduction Centre. So working with possibly the highest conflict family situations where a parent has taken a child from another country or retained them in another country.
Hi everyone, I'm Romina Cameron. I run my own practice, ARC Mediation Limited. I'm a family mediator and a PPC, and I also work with NFM.
And I'm Katie Harris. I'm the founder of Mediation Matters Midlands Family Mediator. So we'll start with the questions. To start off, I think I'd like to look at preparation and expectations. So I'd like to ask, from your experience, what do you most want participants to understand before mediation begins with an interpreter? And that question to Romina.
Thank you. So I think it's really important to set expectations that it's going to be different in the sense that it will take longer. So really making it clear that there's going to be some preparation involved that ordinarily we wouldn't have to do when we're working with interpreters. So often people don't understand how the process works anyway. So it's really important that as the mediator, you're making it very clear what the interpreter's role is going to be, how it's going to impact the session, and that the participant is comfortable in kind of all the different formats that we explained for them to expect in the session. So it's just laying out a very clear structure of how it's all going to work.
Can I also add that usually best practice would be to provide them with some sorts of agreement to mediate, because what they discuss is also confidential, so they need to understand that. So I have a document that I send out to the interpreter that's signed to the agreement to mediate as well, especially for the interpreters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, but also we have to make it clear to them that there's got to be there has to be an increase in cost, because of course interpreters, they charge money to be there. So clarity around costs, making sure that the documentation is clearly laid out, the fact that, like Tawhid has just mentioned, they're part of that confidential discussion as well. So making it very transparent as to how it's all going to work.
I think in cases where there's a legal aid contract, obviously the legal aid agency will pay for interpreters reasonable fees as well.
I mean, cost of...
Sorry, Tony, you go.
I was going to say, cost of interpreters can vary quite significantly. So if the client are aware of the cost, if they have to meet that cost, and it's helpful to give them an indication how much they charge hourly. And often if you're working with client interpreter previously, you can tell them that this is the rates of the interpreter, the particularly you're thinking of. But of course, some people will come up and say that I have somebody I know who can interpret for us. Obviously, that wouldn't be possible. So those things we have to bear in mind.
I think it can be worth checking as well that the interpreters don't know the parties, because some communities are very small and there are networks, and to preserve the confidentiality, you need to really make thoroughly sure that they don't know the interpreters. And well, it's best to ask the interpreters as well if they know the parties.
Yeah, and I think just to add a final point on costs, it's not just that the interpreter obviously has a fee that needs to be covered. It's also that mediation will just take longer. So there will be more sessions because of the back and forth, because of the checking, because it's that little bit slower. So it's not just that the interpreter costs money, but actually generally mediation tends to take that bit longer. So you might expect there to be more sessions than ordinarily if you were not using an interpreter.
Okay, so I think setting expectations is really important, making sure that they're clear, and managing the client's expectations. So from there, as well as knowing that preparation isn't just administrative, it's about fairness and informed consent. If we move on to the interpreter themselves, I think we touched on this just in your answers there. But with regards to the interpreter, what makes the biggest difference in terms of neutrality and professionalism from the mediator's point of view? I'll start with Tawi for that one, if that's
Sorry,
okay.
makes the biggest difference. I would say eh, building trust with the interpreters. They need to understand what the roles of mediators are, and they need to know what it is that we do. And often I spend 15 minutes before, or even making a phone call, explain to them exactly what we do and what their roles are, and then so that they're aware of what they're supposed to be doing, basically in the
Mm.
sessions.
I think a lot of them sometimes are legal interpreters in the civil and criminal justice world. So they're used to cases where there can be quite a lot of emotion. But I think it's reiterating that and that their role is just to interpret what somebody is saying, even if they're in quite a highly emotionally aroused state as well, which can be difficult.
Yeah. And I think this links into sort of professional boundaries because a good interpreter understands confidentiality and neutrality, and they understand the importance of not stepping into the conversation themselves. They're not there to summarize, they're not there to kind of add words in. They are literally there to translate word for word. And as the mediator, it's important that we're also checking in constantly, that we're understanding what the client's saying. So if you're able to have a conversation with the interpreter beforehand, not only are you able to then explain the process and kind of lay out your expectations as the mediator, but they are also then going to feel more comfortable about what's expected of them.
One thing I've come across sometime when you mention something and the interpreter can make kind of their version of that. And you have to be mindful what it is that they said. Also be mindful that the participant may even understand English, but they're not confident in speaking. So they may know what's been said and the interpreter hasn't interpreted correctly. So that has happened with me. And then that can cause some other problems. So to be aware that just because they need an interpreter, it does not mean that they can't speak English. They just may not be comfortable.
I was working with a Ukrainian family, and the father was still in Ukraine and didn't want to use a Russian interpreter, obviously but obvious reasons and things. And so it's been sensitive to issues like that as well.
Okay, so before we move on to roles and responsibilities, which we've touched on here, it's obviously clear that we need to make sure that we trust the interpreter and that we've got a good relationship with them before kind of moving on to mediating with them as that support. But how do you explain the interpreter's role in a way that protects neutrality and accuracy? How do you explain that? As in to the clients. So Tawid?
Um, Explaining basically as mediators how we would explain to our clients, firstly. So they are obviously may not be aware of mediators role. As I was explaining before, I'll have that 15-minute phone call or even ask them to join me in before, or even provide them with some information way before the event meeting. So roles what we do and what's expected and what they're supposed to do. And part of the agreement that I send out that has that information so that they are aware within their boundary to stay within that.
And how do you explain it to the interpreter themselves to ensure that they stay within their roles? How do you explain to them what you want their job to be?
I think it's a little bit like a mini Mayam almost with the interpreter, as in we focus on those guiding principles that we would be sharing with our clients. So, as mediators, we are impartial. As mediators, we can't give advice. As mediators, we understand that the process is voluntary, but also that it's confidential. And we talk about the two exceptions which break confidentiality. So I think those areas there are probably key points that we should be covering with the interpreter in terms of, look, very similar to us, this is how you're working in this session for this to kind of be suitable for the client. These are the boundaries that you can't kind of overstep. And also just to add, and I hear this a lot from my colleagues, it's often their experience with interpreters, is that almost feel that anxiety to say, oh, hang on, this response, the client responded and it only took them 3 seconds, but you were explaining and taking a minute, for example,
Yeah.
right? So I would say, don't be afraid to stop and say, sorry, can I just understand why it's taking that bit longer? And obviously, I'm bilingual, so I understand that being Italian, I can use, 30 seconds longer to say something than if I was saying it in English. But you generally have a sense if there's being additional words filled in, or if maybe even the interpreter's struggling, because let's not forget there are nuances, like people have dialects, or perhaps they might be speaking the same language, but their interpretation of what they're saying is slightly different. So as the mediator, you are still in control. It's your session with the client. So say, I'm not sure what's going on here. Can we just pause? I just need to understand if the client is understanding what I'm asking. So it's about keeping control, because a lot of the time, I think as mediators, because we're not necessarily doing it all the time, it's the confidence is lacking. So I would say just keep thinking of it as your Mayam and making sure that you're capturing the information you need.
I think good interpreters should know what their roles are. And I think good interpreters, if the dialogue between them and one of the parties is taking longer, will sometimes say, sorry, interpreter just seeking clarification there. So they explain that they're having a little conversation of their own to understand what the client is trying to say.
And how does it differ online versus in person? Do you find there to be more difficulties online or in person, like which is more simple, which is a more simple process, which is more difficult? What problems do you see?
I think for me, I mean, generally, and certainly since the lockdown, all of our mediations are online because one of the parents can be in Australia or America or, Abu Dhabi, for example. I think one of the difficulties is if you've got both parties on the same screen with the interpreter and the both parties speak the language. And what has happened sometimes is they've understood and want to respond before the interpreter has translated it for us as the mediators. So we're on a back foot because we don't know what's going on, what's being said, and whatever. And I think if that gets really difficult sometimes, which it has done, at least online, we can pause it and put everybody in the waiting room and get the interpreter in to find out what was being said as well. That's a bonus, I think.
Okay. So making these small adjustments early on and putting those boundaries in place hopefully will prevent bigger problems later on. If we can move on to the session itself, once mediation's underway, how does your mediation style change when you're working with an interpreter?
I tend to keep my questions and summaries quite short. So it gives the interpreter time to, so I break it down and I speak slower and things so the interpreter understands what I'm saying. as well, and to give them an opportunity. And it can be very easy to want to start talking again, but it slows down an
Mm.
awful lot with interpreters, and you have to wait until you're sure that it's all been said and understood.
I would
And
agree.
Janet, oh, sorry.
No, no, go on, go on.
I was just going to say, do you find that difficult? Obviously, it's another skill for us to manage as mediators, to then slow things down, to be managing, listening to the interpreter, looking at the responses, reading the body language, everything. Does it feel like it takes a lot more energy to manage a session with an interpreter for those reasons?
I mean, I do it quite a lot now. I've been doing it for 10 years. And so I think I am used to it. I know it's different from my domestic mediations, and I have to be different in them as well. So I'm quite used to it. And I do at least one a week. So.
And Tawid and Ramina, how does it feel for you guys?
I mean, when I'm talking to clients, I have to keep in mind that the interpreter I'm talking to and the client, their body language, be aware of what's going on, because sometimes how the client's body language may reflect what's going on. But talking to the interpreter, keeping it very short to the point, you do have to change the style. You can't use your normal mediation skill way. It's simply keep it very short to the point and make sure the interpreter understood what you're saying, and then they can go back and interpret. And that's how it should be, actually.
Yeah, I think my process is just to be more structured, and I kind of keep in mind less is more. So exactly as Toid has mentioned, it's kind of the more deliberate, direct, shorter sentences, kind of avoiding lots of layered questions. And I also monitor time quite more closely when I'm doing it. And just, again, it goes back to the initial preparation and setting of expectations. If we do that really well, everyone knows kind of how the session's going to go. We mentioned before about sort of face to face versus shuttle. If we're face to face, where the interpreter sits, their positioning in the conversation, they are in the conversation, but they are not part of it, as in they're not adding detail. So again, I think it's just making sure, checking in with the clients that they're understanding the questions, that the flow's working, and just being okay that it's going to feel different. It's not going to feel like a normal session. It's just not.
So it's about adapting pace and structure. It's going to be slightly different to a normal mediation, but we need to always ensure that we don't lose authority. I think that's probably
And I
summarised.
think, yeah, Katie, going back to what I said before, I think you can feel on the back foot as the mediator when both parties speak the language, although one has said, look, I'm very comfortable with English, as you know, and is happy. And then they hear what's being said, so they're processing that before you know what's being said. So,
Yeah.
you're a bit on the back foot because you don't know.
And how do you manage that, Janet? Do you kind of jump in and ask them to stop because you need clarity on what they're talking about when they start conversations in their own language? What do you do
Well, I mean,
if
obviously, if the other party intervenes, I ask them to pause and say that we will come to them, but it's important that I, as a mediator, understand what is being said. So we do stop people from intervening, and just to hold on to listen, and wait. But
okay.
it's hard sometimes.
And on that, how do you check that the participants, so where one is one language, one is another, how do you check the participants feel understood without undermining the interpreter? So when the interpreter relays your question, how do you check that they've understood it? Because sometimes things can get lost, can't they? In that interpretation. So how do you check that without kind of saying, almost suggesting that the interpreter's not doing their job? Because that must be quite tricky.
I'll simply just ask them basically, have they really understood? And the interpreter will really have to go back. That can you go back and confirm, especially key points, if it's to do with finance, really direct numbers or so on. If there's any other things, is really get that information word for word. If it's significant, then to confirm that you have understood and they have understood what you're talking about.
And the
Okay.
key, it's not about undermining the interpreter. So it's about reinforcing that idea of, informed participation so that we're checking in to make sure that the client is comfortable, but also, we should be checking in with the interpreter that they're comfortable, that they're okay with what's being said and they understand and they're still kind of okay to continue because they may have never been involved in family mediations. They may never have heard certain things that are being disclosed. So it's just that open conversation.
Yeah, I had a case with a Argentina once, and we had a Spanish interpreter, and she didn't understand some of the legal language that was being used because the cases are very technical legally as well. And she had to say, "I'm really sorry, I don't know what the word is for that." So that was a bit of a tricky one.
I was just going to ask about are there ever any signals that you need to look out for that tell you that something isn't working well? Could you pick that up, Janet, in that scenario before it occurred? Could you tell that that mediator was the interpreter?
No, and we were online, and we always co-mediate these cases as well because they're high conflict, which again is another advantage, I think, to have two mediators. Um, but we were in a break, and she was with us, and she said, "I don't understand some of the language." So we did actually say, "Well, we're just going to have a little break," and she went and did some research. So we were able to do that, but that was that particular setup as well. So.
Okay. Torrid, have you had any issues with that?
I
Where it's not been
I
working well?
didn't have exactly the similar, but there are always issues. You don't know what you're going to end up with. I tend to work with, I mean, Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, and other languages that I'm familiar with. Some of it I do know generally, but Arabic, which I can understand but not fluent. So you get a sense what's going on, and there are times that things will come up. You'd have to adapt your situation and find a solution there and then. But there has been one occasion that we needed to talk about a little bit about consent orders and so on towards the end of the mediation, and something that they have to sometimes interpret or interpret from what it means. So you need to make sure that they haven't done that, they haven't misunderstood what you're trying to say. And
Mm.
also, it does take to be aware, to prepare the clients that it does take significant amount of time. So in preparing themselves, expectations, it's like there's three-way conversation going on. It will take, it will take a lot more time.
Okay. And before we started, we had a very brief chat around where things had gone wrong. I know a couple of you had got some interesting stories. So it'd be lovely to hear those. Just before we do, I wanted to also let everyone know that we do have time after everyone's been talking to answer any questions. So feel free to put them in the chat and we'll come to them once we've finished having this conversation. So Janet, can I start with you? You had some quite interesting experiences.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to something maybe Romina said as well about you have to be professional with these interpreters and you mustn't be afraid of speaking out and saying, no, you can't do that. But one of the first examples I have of where it went wrong was we were all actually face to face in the office and we were looking at different contact scenarios for this couple, Polish couple. And basically, we were running through all these different options on a flip chart, which sounds like it was a long time ago now, doesn't it? But we were all in a circle looking at the flip chart, and the interpreter actually said, "Can I make a suggestion?" And myself and the other mediator turned and said, "No, that is not your role." But I think they're quite, they are cases where you, as an interpreter, you can get involved in them. Another one was talking about English school holidays and the interpreter wanting to explain that in England we had half terms. And again, us saying, no, we'll explain that and you can interpret it because then you've lost control. You don't know what they're saying and their interpretation of what half term is. And then I had another one recently and it was Hungary, Romania. And it was about getting a visa to live in the other country. and the interpreter wanted to share their experience of moving and how they'd got a visa and things. And again, we had to say, no, that's not your role. You need to go back to your lawyers for that advice. So those are some of my worst case scenarios.
Okay. And Tawid, I know that you'd also had some experiences, if you'd like to share those.
Yeah, I suppose few that I've had is really down to the cultural side too, because you're getting an interpreter. Probably most of my cases are subcontinental people, and they start bringing their cultural side to see beware of it, that not to get the interpreters interpreting and saying things that is cultural, and sometime as Janet mentioned, they will put their own suggestions. And at that time, even though it may be useful, but you need to reiterate, look, you're not supposed to be doing that. Don't suggest anything at this point. We're here to do that. And because one of my case that the client, uh, we were mentioning about how financial works in certain, jurisdiction in India or somewhere else. And the interpreter was too keen to put their views as well. So there is a cultural side to it to be aware of.
Okay. And
And
Ramina?
yeah,
Sorry.
it's going to come off the back of what Tarid was saying, because as a mediator, often you might think, well, this seems ideal on paper, same sort of cultural background, it'll make the sort of interpreting side of things super easy. But as with my example, as the session unfolded, I sort of began to realize that they were almost aligning their cultural norms. So they were explaining and contextualizing and almost justifying the other party's position, so having an opinion. And there was no malice to it, but of course you can't do that in mediation. And I mean, I know as mediators, we will all have sat there at some point and had a thought or feeling about one of the parties in particular. But hopefully we all, are able to address that, realign ourselves and make sure that what we put out is completely neutral. And in fact, the participant actually managed sort of in broken English to say that, they're explaining, they're not interpreting. And to me, that was quite pivotal, because I kind of thought, right, this isn't working. So I had to pause, set the boundaries again, kind of reset, and just remind the interpreter what their position was. Again, not in an undermining way. It's just, you are to facilitate this conversation. It's not for you to have an opinion or to bring your experiences into it. So, shared cultures can be as complex as shared language, right? So that's something to definitely look out for.
And I think
It,
going on from that point, sorry, Katie,
it's
I
okay.
think in some cultures, there are different perceptions of the roles of males and females in society as well. And I think in some cases, if it is a female client who cannot speak English, be sensitive about whether to try and use a female or a male interpreter as well, because again, I think that can inhibit the client speaking freely sometimes.
Do you think to rebalance that and consider whether it would be better to have a male, because otherwise it kind of makes the other client feel that they're already kind of, I suppose, that the conflict is exacerbated because there's two females. Is that what you mean, Janet?
Or just be no, so that if it's a female client, that it's a female interpreter because they feel.
Okay,
But yeah, that's another dynamic because
right.
a lot of mediators are female, and so if you have a female interpreter and it's a heterosexual couple, you've got possibly in our cases four females and one male on the screen.
Mm.
Hmm. Romina, did you want to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to what Janet said, which is a really good point, which is there's nothing wrong with us as mediators doing a little bit of research. And we touched on it last year. We did a webinar on sort of cultural differences in mediation to understand kind of the cultural backgrounds of our clients, to have a bit more knowledge. And the reason that helps is because sometimes, exactly as Janet said, we have clients that just do not feel comfortable sharing certain things if there is a male present. So it's just being aware of that. And you want them to have the same access to mediation as everyone else. But the only way we can do that is by being really informed of the clients that we're dealing with and the boundaries that they're going to face, even participating. So yes, it's about that balance as well. So yeah, it's not great when there's 3 or 4 females and there's one male, so definitely that's something to think about. But there is also the other aspect, which is this participant going to feel really comfortable disclosing in this setting? Would they even, we know that to lots of cultures, mediation is not even something they would necessarily consider because of those boundaries to kind of enter mediation. So yeah, it's just a little bit of additional research, not saying don't take it on, but if you're going to take it on, understand that there are different complexities to having an interpreter in mediation.
And sorry to ask, but when you're looking at trying to work out what the most appropriate interpreter would be or who it may be, do you ask the clients, do you prefer to have a male or a female? Do you actively ask that question?
So I do. I kind of will just ask them if they have an idea. So I kind of leave it quite open. Do you have an idea of, the kind of interpreter that you would find comfortable speaking to? So I don't really position it male or female just in case. I'm kind of try and keep it. And very often they will say, actually, I wouldn't feel comfortable if it was. Yeah, I've had men say I wouldn't feel comfortable having a woman interpret. Certainly, I think mimes in particular, where it can be quite raw when they're explaining the backstory, right, as to how they've got to where they are. They can be quite sort of sensitive around who's interpreting and what they're going to be like. So yeah, it's definitely worth asking and getting an idea.
And that's a really key point, actually, Romina, is talking about the MIAM as well as the mediation, because sometimes I think we don't even realize that they need an interpreter until the MIAM. But if we know beforehand, we've got to consider the differences that in the process of the MIAM and the mediation. So that's a really key, important point for us to note about, they are at that point disclosing a lot of information in what is that confidential space. And I think we do get to see a lot more of the difficulties and the upset, the emotional fallout during those MIAMs, don't we? So that's really useful to know. Do you have anything to add to?
I was going to say most of us probably do pre-MIAM. And at that time, on a phone call, you realize, or even speaking with the first party, I usually realize that actually we will need an interpreter here. And even when you're writing an email to the party who doesn't speak the language, sometimes I have my information pack that is in multilingual, so I provide leaflets in that language. So sometime I would write a very simple email in English and get it translated. Hopefully, it's done online correctly. But I will also provide the English and the translation, but please see the leaflet, which was customized to the language that I've done. So they've got an understanding what it is that they're going, what mediation is. And if I realize the person wouldn't be able to speak at all any English, I will get that phone call through an interpreter. Yes, it costs a little bit of money for me, but this is what you build into your cost, because how else are you going to get that person into mediation? So as much as possible, you realize that when you are actually talking to the first party, the other party doesn't speak English. How do you bring that person to mediation? So there are steps you need to take before that.
Yeah, and I think that's where you have to draw on your experience as a mediator in the MIAM, because a lot of people desperately want to show that they can speak English. It's a source of pride and everything. And I think it is very gently saying to them, my experience is that these cases can be emotional, and sometimes people do find it difficult to convey those feelings in another language. And so we have the interpreter there as backup for you when you're struggling as well.
That's very useful.
And I think we've all spoken before about, in interpreters and kind of where do you find interpreters, and and I think it's important to obviously, I know there are lots of great agencies, but once you've used an interpreter and they seem to work really well, it's really common as mediators that we'll fall back to that interpreter. So that confidence in someone knowing your process really, really helps. And if they're new and you've never worked with them, it goes back to what we were all saying right at the beginning. It's making sure they understand how mediation works, what we are trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, what the participants hoping to get out of it. And also that it's not just about obviously the MIAM, but if we go to joint meetings, there's that other person, they need to consent to this interpreter being used, about confidentiality. So if they're understanding from the beginning what their role is and how it works, you're less likely to have issues as the mediation progresses.
And Romina, you spoke just a moment ago about interpreters and where to find them. You mentioned agencies. Can I ask you guys to share with us where you do find your interpreters from? And if, for example, anyone on here wanted to reach out to you to ask for anyone that you could recommend, would you be happy for them to do that?
I mean, sure, there's a national register, kind of a public service of interpreters and translators that we can kind of go to. And of course, I've got a few that I've just used along the years that I've done the, mediation with interpreters. But I do think it's probably raised a really interesting point, and I was thinking this just yesterday evening, where it would be helpful within our family mediation bubble if we kind of did share that expertise with each other. So maybe even have a resource tab, which I think I'm going to add to my own resources, just so that it's there and available, and then other mediators can just go and look at it and scroll through and find them. But yeah, I think sharing that knowledge.
I think the
also
legal
like,
aid agency, if they're funding it, I think sometimes if they audit a file, they will pull and query why you use that interpreting service. And I think they used to have a sort of quality standard. I'm not sure how much that is in place anymore, I'm afraid, because I don't do legal aid. But I think that's a really good idea, Romina, to have a directory that we could share.
It would be great, particularly when people are worried about whether or not that interpreter is able to stay within the boundaries and expectations, which I did want to touch on in a moment. I don't know where that might be shared. We can perhaps have a conversation about that at a later date. Unless, Romina, did you have an idea on that?
Well, so I actually set up a free resource, and I did it from a mediator's perspective, just of
Okay.
my knowledge of the last nearly 10 years of doing this, where I thought, what are the common questions? Where do clients always seem to stumble? What do they really need? If they're going through particularly tough times from a mental well-being point. So I set up the Family Mediation Project, which is totally free. So you can just go on there and find lots of resources. So I will go on and add a resource tab for interpreters there, and then people can just go and scroll through. And I'll work with the other guys and see if they've got some they want to add on it, and see we can have a collective place.
I just want to throw something out there for the mediators who's listening to this. Maybe we could work as, like I speak two, three languages as opposed to very fluently. So maybe we can share that, I can, you can mediate in a number of different languages and co-mediate with the other mediators. So if we can bring our own mediators and they're already trained, they can do the languages, and that would be that one way of doing it.
Do you feel that having a mediator who can speak other languages is often better because they understand the agreements to mediate the limitations? Would that be the ideal scenario?
I mean, I do, as I said, multilingual, and Romina, you also do that. So it really does. I mean, sometimes I'm switching to English to Bengali, Bengali to English, because then making sure sometimes that the person who speaks English may not speak fluent Bengali, let's just say. So making sure that they've understood that. So sometimes, having to be able to do multilingual mediation can help. And within our pool of mediators, if they speak other languages, and we can have that resources and say, look, we have somebody who can speak that language.
Yeah, when you're doing that resource, do you think that you might be able to put in addition on there like a tick box as to whether they are actually mediators, so people see that, because I think that would be really useful to a lot of us.
I think that's just a brilliant idea. And
Yeah, FMCs are trying to do it on the website, isn't it? I think
Yeah,
they're thinking
I
of
think
doing
there's
that now.
something on the FMC about
yeah,
whether they speak any other languages, but
yeah, it might be on the actual register when you're looking up a mediator, or perhaps it's something that we could definitely talk about them adding, so that if they're
They
looking up,
are considering that, what I'm aware. So
yeah,
this will be potentially in the future be added as a tab to
yeah,
choose other skills, I think.
I'm on the FMC's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion panel, so I can raise that as well to make sure that we start to flag that up.
yeah. Because I think often, I don't know about kind of your experiences, but I get asked a lot, where can I find, accredited mediators? So of course we direct them to the FMC's register, and we know from calls that we get that that's exactly what clients, they kind of stumble and find it and they find their mediators. But it would be really helpful then if there's that added information as to whether they are bilingual or if they're used to kind of working with interpreting different languages for mediation. I think that's a brilliant idea. And also it gives us an excuse to co-mediate more, which as mediators, we talk about it and all of us tend to say, that it's so beneficial to our practice. So it
And
seems,
and and that actually draws me to a question I wanted to ask, and that was going to be about costs. As soon as you say co-mediation, my ears prick up and I go, additional cost. So we're talking co-mediating, but that may be a cheaper way, I suppose, to have an interpreter with each of you. So just from a point of view of costs, how do you explain that to the clients? And also, what are those costs roughly? I know they're going to vary massively, but Tawi,
I mean, I the interpreters I use, they range from 60 to 120 pound
that per hour.
per hour, yes. But most of the ones that I use, they're around 60 pound range. And I would let the client know well in advance that this is the cost. And bearing in mind, although it might be 1 hour, but because you need a lot more time, so you may have three sessions. If you didn't have the interpreter, you may have one session. So to make manage their expectation, to expect to have more, and then the other party may say, well, why am I paying for her cost or his cost for interpreter? Why is it coming out of my pocket? So that's something you have to explain. This isn't coming out from any, this is the process. We have to allow both party costs to be met, basically.
yeah, but I guess also going back over what we just discussed, and I think it's been confirmed, Tori, that you're correct, that the FMC is actually looking to add that information, which will be super, super helpful for all of us. So we'll look out for that. I think if we had mediators, and I'm sure we do, because just in this call, we've got two mediators that can speak other languages, it would cut out the amount of extra work we have to do in preparation to get an interpreter ready and kind of up to speed as to what's expected. So that is a way of kind of reducing costs. Yes, you'd have the additional mediator, but think of all the, we've all been there, the experiences we've had, the amount of time and energy that we spend with using that interpreter, that would essentially be eliminated, because then have a mediator that knows exactly what's expected, what's not okay, what the boundaries are, you know.
I certainly would feel much more comfortable having a mediator who was able to interpret. And I think there's a heavy responsibility on us as mediators, isn't there, to make sure the process runs smoothly. We're dealing with really delicate areas of people's lives, and actually having someone that we don't know, or they don't know the process, that may accidentally do something that jeopardizes it without even intending to do so because they don't understand it. I think actually having, for me personally, I'm going to be like, right, if I need an interpreter, I'm going to first look for mediators who speak that language rather than an interpreter externally. So just on that, would it be useful actually at this moment, Romina and Taweed, for you to just let everyone know what languages that you speak so that you are available for anyone looking for the languages that you are able to converse in? And then I was going to ask another question, but I forgot what it was, but just that question for now.
Yeah.
Answer that one for now. Yeah, so I can speak Italian, and Torrid, I know you can speak more than
Yeah,
one.
it's not just the language, it's also the understanding the culture, which is probably quite a significant part as well. I mean, I speak Bengali, I also understand and speak some Hindi, and I lived in Middle East, so I speak a little bit of Arabic or enough to know what's going on, but I would not mediate in Arabic. But Hindi, Punjabi, I can understand, a little bit of Urdu I can understand, but I would not mediate where I'm not comfortable. But fluently in Bengali, I can do that. And what I will say, it's a lot more as well than just the language. It's understanding the culture and understanding the faith and religion, and that brings wider context in mediation. So when you have somebody from, let's just say, ethnic minority or from Bangladesh or Muslim, if you're mediating in that language or even being aware of the culture, it makes a significant difference in your mediation.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I've been lucky to train in several countries in the world around this model of mediation that we use, and I have actually worked with Italian and Japanese co-mediators. There is an extra burden on them sometimes because they do have to then translate for me because I appallingly only speak English. But yeah, it can really help, and it can help the parties, I think, to know there's somebody who is fluent in their language there as a mediator.
Just before we go to questions, I'm really conscious of time. One thing we haven't really touched on that much, which is actually massively important, and probably a lot of people are asking this question, with regards to protecting ourselves as mediators and making sure that everyone is on the same page. So the agreement to mediate is obviously our key document. Is that really all that you utilize, as well as that pre-session of talking to them? Is it just them signing the agreement to mediate, or is there anything else that you think is essential?
As I was saying from the beginning, that I mentioned that I have a special one for the interpreter because I
Okay.
took out certain things, and I felt in the roles of interpreter, just like you may have one for solicitors when you're doing hybrid mediation, the roles of the solicitors, equally the roles of the mediators, or rather interpreters, what they should or shouldn't be doing, very clearly laid, and so that's particularly for the interpreters.
And Janet and Romina, do you have separate ones, or do you utilize the standard agreements to mediate?
I do have a separate one, and I mean, similar to Shuttle, I have something separate for Shuttle just to make it very clear for clients. But the other thing that's important to remember and note is confidentiality. So it's a third party to the conversation, and if it moves to a joint meeting, all participants have to agree to that interpreter being present and being privy to those private conversations. So confidentiality is really important there as well. Janet, I don't know if
Yeah,
you
I
have it.
mean, the admin at the service I work for sort all of that out before I get involved, so I don't know.
That's fine.
Okay.
Could I just pick up a point actually, because we
Of
did,
course.
Chloe's made a really interesting one. And I think Janet, you were saying about working with various mediators that are bilingual. One of the things that I found and something to look out for, because you mentioned about, what do we need to do in order to keep ourselves safe, is clients that will call expecting you to understand and know their culture. So I get that a lot because of my name. So I've had a lot of clients that are Muslim who will almost try to get me on their side. They'll say, oh, you understand because, make assumptions. And I would say, I do understand the culture. My husband is Muslim. I understand a lot about the Pakistani culture. I'm very proud to understand a lot about it. But I have to very quickly put those walls and boundaries up to kind of say, we're not aligned. I'm not on your side. You know, just because I understand it doesn't mean I agree with it. So that's probably the biggest thing for me as a mediator, that I've had to almost take a step back. You know, I do feel a little bit like my personal space gets invaded. They start talking about my name. They ask me if my children are Muslim, you know. I'm very proud to share that they are, but it's not something I want to talk to my clients about. So it's just about making sure, just, you know, almost I put sort of my hat on, my mediator hat on, and I will disclose what is relevant to you as a client, to know whether you are, you know, English or, you know, Pakistani or whatever. It doesn't go beyond that. So that's one thing I'd say, to safeguard yourself, your personal space.
Oh, true.
Okay.
Yeah, very true. I'm just
Sorry,
saying, very true. I have a similar experience, to be mindful of that.
okay, I'm just going to go over to the questions that we've got here. First of all, Marianne Roberts has said, Dr. Brooke Townsley has written a valuable article on the use of interpreters in mediation, which she can pass on. Although she said that her chat is disabled at the moment, so you can't do it through the chat. But then Louise Kelly has asked, do you work with family members as interpreters? And if so, what are the additional issues and things to consider?
Can I just answer that? Have done only the MIAM, and I will say yes, I can with your friend, so that this information can be explained through, because that's the first time I'm getting to know their issues. If they're confident, then only the MIAM, but equally they will have to sign the agreement to mediate, but never do the joint session with the family members or friends.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, agreed.
And Marianne just put her hand up, which I presume is in response to the question that I've just asked, but I've no idea how to do anything about that question. Does anyone know? She can't speak to us, can she? You'd have to put it in the chat, I think, Marianne.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, had you finished on that topic, Tawid?
Yes, I was just saying, to avoid any in joint session, not to do bring friends or families or anybody they may know, because that could cause a lot of problem. And also, you're not agreeing to the principle of mediation. So getting a professional outside, or somebody who's got their job as an interpreter, and you are safe that what you're doing is covered, and they're not going to be able to be, they're going to remain neutral.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add before we finish? Because we're running out of time. All good. Okay, so I think what's come out of today's conversation is that working with interpreters isn't a bolt-on skill. It changes the pace, the power dynamics, and the responsibilities in the room. So I think we've got to really not just literally add it. As I've said, it can't be a bolt-on, can it? It needs to be something that is considered and looked into very deeply before we make that decision to involve them, ensuring that we've got obviously all the paperwork correct. We've got the agreement to mediate, or an alternative agreement to mediate signed, that we've got all parties in agreement to the interpreter being there, considering who that interpreter may be. I think it was really important, Tari, that you pointed out about culture as well, being important. So it's not just about the language, it's about the culture as well. I think that's a huge thing that we need to consider. So thoughtful preparation, clear boundaries, and transparency with participants are what protect us, and fairness and trust in the process. So thank you very much. Oh, there's a note in here. I was just about to say thank you to you guys. I will write to Marianne after. Okay. So Julie said that she'll follow it with Marianne and get that information. So for now, I just want to say thank you so much to you all, Janet, Tawid, and Romina, for joining us today and sharing with us all of the information that you have. I think that will be really helpful to anyone that has been listening. And I'm pretty certain that you'd probably all be open to anyone reaching out, but I don't want to say that. But thank you so much. It's been really useful for me to learn from as well. So thank you, guys.
Can
Thanks,
I just add?
everybody.
Yes. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you. And just one thing, if anybody needs multilingual leaflets and information, they can find it on my website, and I'm adding to them as time goes. So if they
And your
need
web
any information,
and your website, Tawid.
Salam Mediation. Salam Mediation.
Okay. And Romina.
So the Family Mediation Project is the free resource that I'll be updating. Yeah.
Okay. And so where's that found? www.
Yeah, the Family Mediation Project. mediation.co.uk.
Wonderful. And Janet?
Well, I mean, obviously, Reunite International Child Abduction Centre has lots of useful information for parents who unhappily and professionals who find themselves in this situation.
One other thing, Kate, I would like to mention that I believe I've just recently done a very simple leaflet for the FMC, and that is going to be translated, and would be available hopefully in few weeks or so, or even soon. I don't know exactly when, but there will be some basic information about in other languages about mediation.
Yeah, can I
Love.
just, sorry, very quickly before my voice goes completely, say that we're all quite a tight group. We all work together. You know, Toyd and I, we work on Family Mediation Awareness Week. And so ultimately, we're working very closely with the FMC. So if there's anything new that comes out that we think's relevant, we'll always be signposting to the FMC. Most of all my stuff is always linked back to the FMC. So that should be kind of the main resource that all mediators use. And ultimately, I do view us all as a family. So you're more than welcome to reach out if anyone needs anything. I'm happy to always have a conversation with a fellow colleague, or even if you're not a mediator.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you, everybody. It's
Thank
been
you.
brilliant to have you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.